Todd Richards here, Roots, Hearts,
and Soul.
Stefan and I are launching this podcast based off cookbook Roots, Heart, and Soul by myself, Todd Richards, with a great help from Chef Stefan, the man, the myth, the legend himself.
Oh, you stop, you. We have such a beautiful history together.
I mean, it's crazy. Really, what people are going to get from this podcast is telling the story of Afro people, Afro cuisine.
We're going to be telling the story of the Pan-African diaspora.
Roots, heart, soul of the world, as we say. We are launching in a couple of weeks here. Some terrific guests. Stay tuned. Follow us on all our social media at Chef Todd Richards in all formats. Chef Stefan, what's yours?
ChefStefan.it, AYITI. This is the correct way to say Haiti.
Well, we're getting education already.
So if you want to find out more, if you want to listen to great stories being told by amazing, amazing culinary talents, we're going to be hearing stories from Africa all the way to the Caribbean, all the way to the Americas. It's going to be something special.
Giving everyone the good rhythm, the good vibes.
Yeah, baby.
We look forward to seeing everyone. Talk soon.
Westholme is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
You're listening to Heritage Radio Network.
This is What Doesn't Kill You, Food Industry Insights. I'm your host, Katie Kiefer, and today we're going to talk something a little different because it's summertime. My guest today is Will Harlan, who is the Southeast Director and Senior Scientist for the Center for Biological Diversity. Prior to working at the center, Will also worked for the Sierra Club, protecting forests and indigenous lands, and he wrote a national best-selling book called Untamed. I got to read this. The Wildest Woman in America and the Fight for Cumberland Island. And his other work has appeared in the New York Times and the National Geographic. And he holds multiple master's degrees. I mean, this is one of those people, Will, you're one of those people that just makes me feel so inadequate. Like, I have completely wasted my life because here you are, a young thing. I mean, honestly, I did look at your photograph. And all of you people are young things. Or maybe it's just that I'm an old thing. And everybody looks young to me. Anyway, welcome.
Thank you, Katie. That's really kind of you to say. I'm deeply curious, and so I follow my curiosities wherever they lead. And fortunately, they've led me to some really amazing people and places.
Yeah, that's fabulous. Well, we share that characteristic because I am also very curious. The only difference is that you actually have some discipline, and I don't. I'm more like a magpie. I will take a thread from everything because everything is interesting. Anyway, so the reason I invited you on the show today is because in my other life here in Southern New England, I do another local show, and we did one about horseshoe crabs, and I found the experience really interesting. My interview guest was a scientist from the Department of Environmental Management, but she was talking specifically about Rhode Island and a survey program that they're running and that she is running specifically. And then I thought about when I was reading up on this, I found your press release at the Center for Biological Diversity, and you're going to talk about that in a second. Where they talked about a campaign you're mounting to try to restore the crashing populations of the horseshoe crab. And the reason we're talking about the horseshoe crab, people, because I know most of the time, Will, I focus on water issues in the United States. Like this whole year, I've been talking about water. But this is a watery thing, too. And the horseshoe crab is what they call a keystone species, which will explain to us in a minute. But the reason I brought him on was because horseshoe crabs are one of those sort of unappreciated animals that feed part of our food chain. In other words, we wouldn't have what we have without these keystone species. So that's why I wanted to talk to Will about it. So first, Will, thank you so much for joining me and welcome. And tell us something about the Center for Biological Diversity and what you do within that organization.
Sure. The Center for Biological Diversity is a national conservation nonprofit focused on saving life on Earth. We especially are focused on endangered species and species that don't always get the attention of the public, like horseshoe crabs.
Right.
Some of
They're
the
not fluffy.
non-charismatic species.
They're not
right.
fluffy and cute. So, people don't want to think about them.
That's right. Although we've been really inspired and encouraged by the outpouring of support for our work around horseshoe crabs. I think they do touch a chord with a lot of folks. I think because many folks have grown up seeing them on the beach and used to
Right,
see them by the hundreds and thousands and now
right.
rarely see them anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. And I saw one. It's funny. After I did the show a couple months ago with Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, I went over to visit a friend on Block Island because I'm quite close to Block Island, and they have a robust survey going on Block Island. I'm not quite sure who's running it, but anyway, I did happen to spot a rather small, must have been a male horseshoe crab who was completely crusted with barnacles, which I guess indicates some age, right?
That's right. And
So
that's
anyway,
encouraging to see. That's
yeah, it
that's
was
great.
encouraging. Yes, it was indeed. And I did flip him over and put him back in the water because he had managed to get himself on his back. And that's what we're supposed to do, right?
That's great. Yes, thank you for doing that. That helps him. That helps the whole population. They usually can. They often can right themselves using their long, spiky tails, but sometimes they can't.
That's
And
right.
and so, yeah, a helping hand goes a long way.
Yeah, absolutely. So, with your role, you're a senior scientist and you work in the Endangered Species Program, hence the connection to the horseshoe crab. And I loved your response when I invited you onto the show. You were like, I'm dying to talk about this wonderful species. So, tell us some of the history of the horseshoe crab because it really is one of the most ancient of all the creatures that remain on this planet, right? I mean, it predates dinosaurs, doesn't it?
It is a living fossil, one of the oldest creatures on Earth, dating back at least 450 million years.
Oh my
So
God.
it's an ancient species that is largely unchanged, still coming ashore today. And some of its ancient biology is one reason it is such an extraordinary species. But they've been coming ashore for millions of years, and they're incredibly adapted and special creatures. One thing that makes them cool, well, there are a lot of things that make them cool. They have 10 eyes, for example.
Okay.
To they
Excellent.
have these horseshoe shaped, helmet shaped heads that protect them, and these long spiky tails. They look rather scary at first glance, but they're completely harmless to humans. They don't bite or sting. You can pick them up safely. Uh, but they have all these adaptations, including their blood, which is a blue blood, a very special, unique kind of blood that, unlike us, we have immune systems that detect pathogens separately. Their immune system is their blood. And so their blue blood can automatically detect any bacteria that invades them. And so that blood protects them. That's a really
Wow.
important adaptation that they have. And
Yeah.
humans have uh, learned from that and are now taking that blue blood to protect us from pathogens. Horseshoe crab blood is currently widely used in the biomedical industry to test medical products and vaccines for safety. So that's
Right.
just one example of their incredible adaptations and how they've been helpful to humans.
But that's also become a major industry, and that is contributing to the crashing of this species population. Isn't that true?
That's right. So sadly, they are being over harvested both for their blood and for their bait. And that's why
Right.
we've seen these dramatic declines in horseshoe crab populations in the past 3 decades. There were millions of horseshoe crabs coming ashore in the 1990s. Today, that number has dropped by two-thirds.
Really?
And we're seeing these crashes all across the Atlantic and Gulf Coast, but especially in Delaware Bay, which is kind of the stronghold
Hmm.
of horseshoe crab populations today. But those declines are happening all across their range, and overharvest is the primary reason. Fortunately, though, there are solutions, which I hope we have time to talk about.
Oh, yeah. Go
Horseshoe,
ahead. Talk about
yeah,
them right now.
well, one of the easiest is the synthetic alternative to horseshoe crab blood. We now can
Right.
take the components of horseshoe crab blood and mimic them in the lab and create a synthetic safety test for vaccines and medical products that doesn't require horseshoe crab blood. And that's
Hmm.
that synthetic is safer, it's cheaper, it's more consistent, more reliable, and it has a limitless supply, unlike our horseshoe crabs, whose
Right.
populations are crashing.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think in Europe they have adopted this synthetic product, but in the United States they're lagging behind. Is there any particular reason why we have not made that adaptation ourselves?
That's exactly right. Europe has adopted the synthetic alternatives, and even some major pharmaceutical companies have voluntarily made the switch. Lilly, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world, has
Yeah.
voluntarily shifted most of their vaccine and medical product testing to this synthetic alternative, the horseshoe crab blood. And they're seeing outstanding results. So they're leading the way along with Europe and other countries. So we know this can be done. The US has just been slow to adopt it. Fortunately, the US Pharmacopoeia, which kind of sets the standards for what's safe and what's appropriate to use in testing of medical
Mhm.
products, has come out with a draft that says yes, these synthetic alternatives are equivalent to horseshoe crab blood. They can be used safely, and that draft is about to be approved later this year. All we need are for pharmaceutical companies to jump on board and start making this switch. And it would also help if the FDA clarified their guidance. They also recognize that the synthetic alternative to horseshoe crab blood is equivalent and can be used safely, but their guidance makes it difficult for pharmaceutical companies to do this broadly. They have to do it on a product by product basis. So there are
Really?
some small logistical hurdles in the way right now, but if we can get those cleared, we can save a lot of horseshoe crabs and all of the species that depend on them.
Yeah, really, because I mean, well, we'll talk about those other species in a second, but I was going to say, they sort of whitewash the collection of horseshoe crab blood by saying, "Oh, yes, we just bleed the animal and then we throw it back in the water and it survives." But according to my contact at the DEM, the survival rate is not really great, is it?
It's not at all, and it's largely unregulated, unsupervised, unmonitored. So we don't
Right.
know for sure how many horseshoe crabs are dying after they're bled. They're taken out of the water either by trawl or by hand, often dragged by their tails. They often die in transport.
Mm,
They're taken to facilities where a needle is stuck in them and they're drained of half of their blood. And then they're
wow.
thrown back into the water. The survival rate is dismal. At least 30% of the horseshoe crabs die. We
Right.
don't know. No one is looking at what happens to them after they're returned to the water. Once they're deprived of
Right.
half their blood, they're likely not able to reproduce very well. They're probably pretty lethargic, probably pretty vulnerable to predation. So there's a lot that's unknown, but it certainly is not good for them.
No, definitely not. I want to talk for a minute about their life cycle, just because, how do they reproduce, for example? How long does it take for them to get to reproducible age? Are they like the orange roughy that needs to be, swimming for 49 years before it can spawn? I mean, what is their life cycle like? And what do they eat?
Yeah, they've got an extraordinary life cycle. I guess let's start with the horseshoe crabs coming ashore, which is in itself a remarkable, astonishing, exciting feat of nature.
I love you, Will. You are so great. I love the enthusiasm. Sorry.
Well,
Just
I
had to
was
say that.
fortunate to witness it just last month, and it
Oh,
was
great.
awe-inspiring. It was stunning, and I even brought my kids, and they thought they would be bored, and they were even awestruck by it.
Sure.
What happens? These horseshoe crabs, they mostly stay offshore most of the year, but around the full and new moons of May and June, the horseshoe crabs come ashore by the thousands to spawn in mass. And so the males typically arrive first and they wait for the females who are larger than the males. The females eventually come ashore and deposit thousands of eggs in little spots between the low and high tide lines of the beach. And the males jostle and fight to be the first to fertilize that little patch of eggs. And the
So the eggs
females,
are just sitting on the surface, and the males just walk over and squirt on them. Is that how it works?
essentially, the eggs eventually get buried in
Mm.
shallow sand there, but the males will actually attach themselves to the females as they're crawling ashore and push each other
Ah,
off to try to be the first to be right on top of the female as she deposits the eggs so that they can be the one to fertilize those eggs first. So it's a brawl on the
it's a
beach
brawl. I
as
love it.
as the females come ashore. But there are tens of thousands of eggs that are deposited, and the females do this sometimes 5 times a season. So we're talking hundreds of thousands of eggs that are deposited and fertilized
Wow.
in these mass spawning events. It's remarkable. What's even more amazing is that other species depend on this mass spawning event, including the endangered bird, the red knot, which has one of the longest migrations of any species on Earth. These
Really?
birds fly from the tip of South America, 9,500 miles, all the way to the Arctic each year, and
Oh
then
my
return.
God, really? Wow.
And these birds, the only way they can make that long journey is to stop along the Atlantic shores of the United States and feast on horseshoe crab eggs. It makes up 90% of their diet as they're making this journey.
That's
If they don't eat,
incredible.
yeah, if they don't eat the horseshoe crab eggs, if the eggs aren't there or they're in low numbers, the red knot does not make the journey or they're not able to reproduce. So this
Wow.
federally endangered bird utterly depends on this mass spawning event of the horseshoe crab and actually times its journey to coincide with these mass spawning events of the horseshoe
Hmm.
crabs.
Hmm. What about other shorebirds? I imagine it's pretty much a free for all for everybody.
That's right.
I
It's
mean,
not just red knots. We highlight the red knot because it's already federally listed, but several
right?
other species of birds that are also declining depend on these horseshoe crab eggs. Those include the ruddy turnstone, the semi-palmated sandpiper, uh, many other birds, and even fish and turtles also depend on these horseshoe crab egg spawning events. And so we're seeing a pretty clear correlation between the decline of horseshoe crabs and the
Hmm.
decline of these shorebirds and these dependent species that have traditionally feasted on these horseshoe crab eggs.
Yeah, incredible. Absolutely incredible. How long does it take for a horseshoe crab to come to maturity and thus being able to spawn?
Right.
Is
So
that
I,
multiple
I didn't
years?
finish the life cycle. So it takes about 10 years for a horseshoe crab to be fully mature and be able to reproduce. But once those eggs are deposited, what doesn't get eaten by the birds, those eggs hatch in a couple of weeks, and
Oh, wow.
little tiny larval horseshoe crabs swim out into the ocean, and a lot of them are gobbled up by fish and turtles and other predators. But those that survive, only 6 out of 10,000
Wow.
survive. But they survive to maturity, and then they'll come ashore in 10 years and be part of that same reproductive process.
That's incredible. I mean, the fact that it takes 10 years, you can see why a population would crash quite quickly if over harvested. And that is the proof in the pudding. We're going to take a short break for a sponsor drop. We'll be right back with Will Harlan to talk more about this keystone species and why it's a keystone species. Stay tuned.
Whether you're a chef or just love going to restaurants, you know the best ingredients are everything, especially when it comes to beef. In Northern Australia, there's a different approach to raising high-quality beef. Westholme, based in Queensland and Northern Territory, is working with the land to create nature-led Australian Wagyu. They look after a sweeping stretch of territory from Brisbane to Darwin, with a climate as varied as the landscape. Westholme raises Wagyu beef, but there's a saying that their real job is to grow grass, meaning that if they take care of the land, the rest will take care of itself. Westholme stewards 16 million acres of rangeland, guided by their natural ecosystems. Westholme's team of rangeland experts and nature managers use a variety of tools to monitor and respond to the welfare of the environment, like satellites that assess grass health and on-the-ground research. Cattle are happier when they have the freedom to forage and explore, so Westholme ensures that they can roam wild, foraging at will for the first 2 to 3 years of their lives. Their cows graze on native grasses like Mitchell grass, which is only found in Australia, along with dozens of other plants, herbs, and seasonal legumes. The result is signature Australian Wagyu, built on a genetic lineage tracing back to Japan and imbued with the terroir of Northern Australia and a flavor suited to complement any cuisine. Westholme believes that when nature leads, flavor follows. Learn more at westholme.com.
So when we talk about a keystone species, we sort of alluded to that with the fish, the turtles, the birds that are dependent upon this creature. What else makes a creature a critter? That very scientific term, a critter. But what else gives it a keystone species status? Is that kind of it, that it plays an important role in the food chain, or are there other characteristics that make it an important species?
Yeah, that's a great question. A keystone is like the last piece in an arch or a bridge. It's the centerpiece that holds that whole bridge or structure together. And that's what a keystone species is, and that's what horseshoe crabs are for coastal estuarine systems.
Hmm.
When the horseshoe crabs disappear, so does everything else. So it has cascading effects across the entire ecosystem. And we've
Right.
seen that, as I mentioned, with the birds, with the red knots, with the ruddy turnstones, with dozens of shorebirds that depend on horseshoe crab eggs. But we
Hmm.
also see it in fish populations, in weak fish and other species that depend on horseshoe crabs and their eggs and their larvae in the water. So the horseshoe crab decline isn't just about the horseshoe crab, it's about the whole beach ecosystem and those cascading effects that are affecting uh, all of these different kinds of species.
Right, right. So the Center for Biological Diversity, you have partnered with a number of advocacy organizations to encourage Endangered Species Act protections for horseshoe crabs. And this is in the face of, I mean, there seems to be some shift, as you pointed out earlier in the show. Like Eli Lilly has decided to abandon using their blood as a testing product for safety of vaccines and medications. So that's going to take some pressure off the population. Why do you think the endangered species? First of all, who gives the Endangered Species Act designation? Who does that?
Yeah, great questions. In this case, NOAA Fisheries, also called the National Marine Fisheries Service, will
Hmm.
make the decision on horseshoe crabs because they are a marine species. Terrestrial species, uh, those designations come from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Uh huh.
In this case, for the horseshoe crabs, uh, NOAA Fisheries will issue a decision, and we should expect that decision, at least a preliminary decision called a 90-day finding, any any day now. They're
Oh,
actually
really?
they're actually overdue by nearly a month, but that 90-day finding was supposed to come at the end of May. We're now near the end of June, and we're eagerly awaiting that preliminary 90-day finding on the horseshoe crabs.
And what will that provide? What protection will that provide? Or is it just a marker along the path to getting status as an endangered species?
So if it receives a positive 90-day finding, which we think it
Hmm.
absolutely will,
Hmm.
it certainly may warrant listing. That kicks off a 1 year review of the species where agencies take a much closer look and do a bunch of research and studies to determine both the status and population of horseshoe crabs and the threats that they are facing. And after a year, they'll issue a final decision. And we think that horseshoe crabs will definitely either receive an endangered or threatened listing under the Endangered Species Act. Already, there are 4 species of horseshoe crabs globally. 3
Right.
are in Asia, and then we have the American horseshoe crab. The 3
Yep.
horseshoe crabs in Asia are all nearly extinct,
Oh, wow.
and so that is putting even more pressure on the American horseshoe crab, and their blood. Sadly, the Asian horseshoe crabs were also over harvested for their blood,
Uh huh.
and now they're nearly extinct. And so now markets are looking to the American horseshoe crab for blood, and that's why we've seen uh, a doubling of horseshoe crab harvests for their blood in the past 5 years. Nearly 1 million horseshoe crabs were harvested for their blood last year.
Wow. Okay. Well, I mean, this is starting to come into focus now, especially with the information about the Asian species, which obviously had the same, qualities in their blood. Are they also similarly used for bait as they are here? The horseshoe crab is not an eating crab, right? Nobody is eating it. Are they eating it in Asia? They don't mind scary looking things the way we do in this
There are
country.
some markets where they're used for food, but primarily they're used for blood and bait. In the United States, they're harvested for bait for the eel and whelk industries, and those eels are eaten, and so are whelk. But these are pretty small fisheries overall.
I
Uh,
was going to say, I never seen an eel in my local,
yep.
and I live in a seacoast town.
Yeah.
I mean,
So
that's got to be very specific, a very specific area for that, right?
it is, yeah, and those are relatively new industries. Uh,
Uh-huh.
After the collapse of other fisheries, these eel and whelk fisheries have kind of emerged in the past 20 to 30 years, but they're not long-standing industries here in the United States. Uh, Sadly, a lot of those bait harvests, though, are kind of blood harvests in disguise. The biomedical industry will contract
Oh.
with bait harvesters to use those horseshoe crabs for blood and then return them to the harvesters for bait, to kind of get around quota limits that are currently
Ooh.
in place for some horseshoe crabs.
Well, there is, I mean, so for example, I read that the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, also known as the ASMFC, has actually raised the harvest quota in some states by prohibiting the harvest of females and only taking males. But I mean, how does that actually successfully protect the vitality of the species if there
No,
are
it
fewer
doesn't.
males to fertilize the female? Like, so I mean, it sounds like window dressing to me. Is that what that is?
I would agree with that assessment. Sadly, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission has recommended increasing horseshoe crab harvests despite
Yeah.
this clear decline. The commission is largely influenced by commercial fisheries. A
Yeah.
lot of their members are representatives of the commercial fisheries industries, and they want to not only increase the harvest of male horseshoe crabs, but there's currently a ban on the harvest of female horseshoe crabs. They have petitioned, they have tried the past couple of years to remove that ban, but
Really?
fortunately, the public outpouring of opposition to that, the public support for keeping that ban in place, keeping female horseshoe crabs in the water and not being harvested, has held up so far. But every year they revisit the horseshoe crab quotas. And for the past few years, they've been trying to increase those quotas and get female horseshoe crabs, uh, the ban removed so that they can harvest female horseshoe crabs as well.
Is this fishery, I mean, is it that valuable? Like, I've never heard of it being a particularly valuable, product, even with the blood product. I mean, how
Well,
much
that's
money are we talking about here that would make that a smart move to make to continue to harvest these animals?
Yes, that's a really great question. And a lot of
Thank
that
you.
data and information is confidential because the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission and the biomedical industry, the blood harvesters, uh, hide behind some shady, some unclear laws that they think keep this information shielded from the public. That's one reason we've filed this Endangered Species Act petition. Is we think that data, that information should be publicly available, so we don't know exactly how many horseshoe crabs are being harvested,
Hmm.
and we don't know uh, the process, the guidelines, the lack of enforcement. There's a lot that we don't know that hopefully this petition will help shine some light on. But uh, the numbers are the profits are probably flowing to the biomedical industry and the harvesters for blood. And that is a very large, lucrative industry that is clinging very tightly to the continued harvest of horseshoe crabs for their blood. They do not want that to go away. And some of them have even fought against the synthetic alternative to horseshoe crab
Really?
blood. So clearly it's a lucrative market, but we don't know the numbers behind it.
Wow, that is fascinating in and of itself. The fact that it's so opaque reminds me of the meat industry. Amazing. So now, who are you working with? Like, what are the next? Okay, so let's start with you. You partnered with a whole group of other advocacy organizations. Who are they, and how did you? Why did you guys all get together?
Yeah, we initially wrote this petition after the last Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission meeting, where they once again tried to open harvest to female horseshoe crabs and increase the horseshoe crab quotas. We realized that they were not going to be able to protect horseshoe crabs long term. And what we were stunned and surprised by was how many other groups and organizations and individuals supported the horseshoe crab protections under the Endangered Species Act. We ended up getting over 25 organizations signing on, including the U.S. Humane Society, the American Bird Conservancy, several Audubon societies, a lot of environmental justice groups. The support
Right.
came from not just environmental groups, but from the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine,
Oh,
from
cool.
100 Miles, from the Humane Society Legislative Fund, from the League of Women Voters of New Jersey. So it was a real amazing mix of folks that stepped up to voice their support for stronger protections of horseshoe crabs.
Wow, that's a very encouraging situation. And when you write these petitions, and so you have the 90-day finding, hopefully the finding will be in your favor. And then the next steps are what? You lobby further with NOAA, or they take that finding and they say, "Yep, this place they definitely need these protections." And then how does the enforcement roll out?
Great questions. So the science is clear.
Thanks.
Uh,
Well, I do try.
well, our petition is 150 pages. The science is pretty clear
Wow.
and robust that these horseshoe crabs are in decline and that they face many threats. We've talked about the overharvest, but they also face threats from climate change, from sea level
Mm,
rise, from loss of habitat to developing and to development and
right.
shoreline hardening. Numerous threats facing this species, and we're not the only ones that have found this. The IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, creates a red list that lists all of the species globally that are most in trouble. And they
Hmm.
just released a finding last year around horseshoe crabs that gave horseshoe crabs a recovery potential score of 0,
Oh,
meaning
no.
unless urgent conservation measures are taken, this species will not survive this century. So that
Wow.
was a pretty alarming finding from a pretty, careful, cautious scientific body that we think kind of affirms the need for the species to be listed as endangered. If it's eventually listed, hopefully that will lead to stronger regulations around the harvest, that will lead to stronger protections around their coastal habitat. And we think that will have cascading effects and positive effects for the shorebirds and the coastal communities that depend on horseshoe crabs.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, we really haven't gotten into the impacts of climate disruption on marine species, but that is a very. I mean, I live in the ocean state, and we have 400 miles of coastline in Rhode Island, and we see we are seeing the predations of climate disruption on the daily basis here. I mean, people are losing their insurance here because insurance companies cannot keep up with the claims. Coastal erosion. So the loss of habitat is very real around here. We've lost huge amounts of beach in my state alone, due to, I guess, sea level rise and too much development on coastal waterways seems
That's
to be
right.
a big. Right? Are there other things that other steps that can be taken to protect the species, or is the Endangered Species Act kind of like the be all and end all of protections for this?
Well, I think that's just the first step. I think
Ah,
supporting synthetic alternatives to horseshoe crab blood is a really simple, easy way for the public to get involved in protecting horseshoe crabs and all the other species that depend on them. This is an easy logistical fix by the
mm,
FDA. It just requires some language to make it easier for pharmaceutical companies to use this synthetic alternative that's already developed and in use. So
mhm.
it's a win-win, and we hope that this petition accelerates that transition to the synthetic.
Right. Absolutely. And Will, I mean, because we're going to wrap up here, how can people learn more about your campaign, and how can they support or help you?
Well, the petition and all of the information about horseshoe crabs is on our website at biologicaldiversity.org. And happy to share my contact information with anyone who would like to learn more. There's also a really robust coalition called the Horseshoe Crab Recovery Coalition, made up of more than 50 organizations all along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts that are actively working to protect horseshoe crabs and the species that depend on them. And they're on the web as well. Joining that coalition can be really helpful, and they provide a lot of really great science and data to support the work.
And are there citizen science opportunities here, Will? I love a citizen
Absolutely.
science opportunity.
Yes. Some of that just happened in May and June when these mass spawning events were occurring. Several folks from the public, from local coastal communities, were out counting the number of eggs on the beaches, counting the number of birds like red knots that came ashore to feast on those eggs.
Hmm.
Every
Cool.
year that's needed on beaches all along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. So folks are interested in doing that. We can always use help in those surveys.
Fantastic. Will, thank you so, so much for joining me today. This is a lot of fun. I mean, I know I'm sorry I interrupt constantly. It's a terrible habit. I've been doing this a very long time, and so I just like to hear myself talk.
Not true
And
at
I
all.
occasionally I let the guest get a word in edgewise.
No, I feel like I rambled on a lot. I really appreciate all of the great questions and all of your interest in this really
Well,
remarkable
let's stay
species.
in touch. I mean, if you have other interesting species that are important to us, both environmentally and really industrially, because I mean, to me, that's what's interesting in a way about this story with the horseshoe crab, is that this is an ancient creature that predates the dinosaur era, that we are, rapidly depleting in the service of, I don't know, our own medical needs, I guess. And basically, it's profit over people as usual, or profit over creatures as usual. That's what I see. I mean, I see this
You
in
nailed
almost
it.
every sphere. Yeah, it's really a sad comment on our society in general, is that we just don't appreciate what we have,
That's
and we'd
exactly
rather
right.
make more money. We'd rather have more money than we would have more species. I mean, right? Isn't that what it comes down to? It's like, do
It,
you want a lot of species or do you want money? Well, we're making our choice, right?
exactly.
Anyway,
Nailed
Will,
it.
thank you. Thank you so much for joining me. And do stay in touch. I mean, let me know if there's other stuff you want to talk about. Call me up. I'm happy to do it.
Absolutely.
Like I said,
Really
Wednesday
appreciate
happens
this.
every week. Yeah, thank you very much. So we'll say goodbye for now. Thanks to our sponsors, as always, for supporting the Heritage Radio Network. And I'll see you next week, folks. Have a great week. Thanks for tuning in. What Doesn't Kill You, Food Industry Insights, is powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening to Heritage Radio Network, food radio supported by you. Keep in touch at heritageradionetwork.org/subscribe.